Okay. All right, kids. So now you, as you probably have seen, last night, Gerald Nadler, who is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, has publicly stated that we are in a state of constitutional crisis. Now, it's not just like anybody else having said it. He is the head of the Judiciary Committee that has the sole constitutional authority to impeach the president. He has held, they've had the vote in the Judiciary Committee to hold William Barr in contempt of court for two things: for refusing to show up and answer questions, and secondly, for refusing to produce the unredacted Mueller report for the Congress. And in response to all of that, in the preparation for holding them in contempt of court, it's just the Judiciary Committee has voted now to do that along a straight party line, which is unfortunate. So that there are 8 more Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee than Republicans, and they prevailed on the vote by 8 votes in the Judiciary Committee. So the response of Trump was that he has now exercised executive privilege over the unredacted Mueller report. And this is very analogous to Richard Nixon having asserted executive privilege over the tapes back in 1974, the Oval Office, White House tapes. And Nixon at that time, back in 1974, kept trying to offer lesser compliances with the subpoena. When they subpoenaed the tapes themselves, he said, "I'm going to write you a summary of the tapes." And they refused to accept that. And he said, therefore, he was exercising executive privilege over all of the tapes. And that went to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court ruled flat out that in a case where the House Judiciary Committee involved in potential impeachment hearings against the president have in fact subpoenaed specific items with regard to which the president is asserting executive privilege, that privilege has to fail. If there's reasonable grounds to believe that there's information in the subpoenaed materials that would substantially contribute to the Judiciary Committee being able to make a decision on that. And so that we have a direct analogy here, and the argument that's going to be made by William Barr as the Attorney General, acting on behalf of the executive branch and on behalf of President Trump, is going to be that they don't believe that there's anything additional in the report, in the unredacted portions, or in the evidentiary documents, the FBI 302s, the actual transcripts of interviews that we conducted, et cetera, that would substantially contribute to the ability of the Judiciary Committee and the House of Representatives to legislate. That's the key to this thing. As of right now, in light of the fact that there has been no official convening of impeachment hearings or impeachment procedures against President Trump, the authority under which the Judiciary Committee and, as of today, the Intelligence Committee, the authority under which they've subpoenaed these materials is just ostensibly toward its legislative function and its oversight function. They have not yet invoked the impeachment jurisdiction. And it was the impeachment jurisdiction that appears to have made all the difference in the Nixon case. That in light of the fact that it was a specific inquiry by the Judiciary Committee under their constitutional authority to impeach the president, that the potential conflict of interest that the president had in withholding the documents in the Nixon case caused the Supreme Court to rule in favor of the Congress. So that what's happening here is that Trump and William Barr are basically pushing the Judiciary Committee and the House of Representatives further and further into having to impeach him or to initiate formal impeachment proceedings in order to get under the four corners of the ruling in the Nixon case. So that's going on right now. And since he has declared a constitutional crisis, Nadler, I was inclined to cite to you the famous observation that in Chinese, the Chinese symbol for a crisis is made up of two separate symbols, one meaning danger and the other meaning opportunity. Now, this is a fairly well-known quotation of John Kennedy made back in 1959 in a speech he delivered in Indianapolis. And it turns out it's not true, unfortunately. It would help us a lot here in the class if it were true. Then I could just say, see, a crisis is both a danger and an opportunity, and let's have a discussion about what the dangers are and what the opportunities are here. But it turns out that Chinese scholars have assailed Kennedy's pithy observation. But let's set aside that and assume that this crisis, with or without the Chinese symbol for crisis, really constitutes both an extreme danger and an extreme opportunity. And one of the things I want to do today is I want to discuss with you what you think the dangers are and what you think the opportunities are that are presented by this crisis. And then I want to talk about your papers, about your little mini theses that you're going to be writing here that are due on the 16th. Now, am I correct that there's a strike being called for the 16th? So, okay, so we're obviously, who is it, how have they gone about calling for the strike? What type of organization, what type of voting process is there? What's it going? How's it going?
ASME was doing it. ASME is what's called.
The Student Association? Well, that does it then. Yeah, maybe, okay.
It's ASME, which is the service workers of broad different industries on campus, and it's across every UC campus.
Yeah.
On the 16th. And there are student organizations as well. The WISP is helping support it, and YDSA, and multitude of others.
Okay, well, let me ask this. How many of you are supporting the strike? Okay, so then we obviously won't have a class that day, or we can do something else that's supportive of the strike. but that's the day that your papers are due. So let's push that to the following Tuesday. For the papers are due, so you'll have extra time to do that and still be able to direct your attention to the substance of the strike. Okay? But still, I still want to talk about the subject matters. Now, that we've given you a few potential prompts for the paper, but what I want to do is I want to try to craft your papers in dialogue with you here today a little more precisely, because I want to be able to ascertain what specific question each of you has that will engine you to the greatest extent to go digging in and finding out stuff in addition to what it is we've already talked about in class. Okay, and I want to say a few words prior to our getting into that discussion, the two discussions of the dangers and opportunities of an impeachment process, and then the substance of your papers. I just want to talk a little bit about this very well-known Steele dossier, because people have understandably turned their attention to the Mueller report, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Even though, as we've talked about a lot in this class, there's a lot of waning interest that's been kind of choreographed around that volume 1 in the collusion, in conspiracy and cooperation and coordination issue. And there's a whole lot of focus on just the obstruction of volume 2. But people have turned to focus on these 2 volumes rather than the Steele dossier. And the Steele dossier, as you probably know, is a compilation of 16 memos that were prepared by a fellow named Christopher Steele. And Christopher Steele, for 20 years, was or eventually became, during his 20-year career, as part of MI6 in England. He was the Russia desk expert in British intelligence. And so that he's very familiar with the dynamics inside Russia. He has lots of sources inside Russia. And he is the one who prepared what they call this Steele dossier, which is really made up of these 16 2- to 4-page memos, and supplemented after the election in December by a 17th memo. Okay, so that's technically what they are. And there's been major efforts made on the part of the right wing, the Trump administration, Fox News, and the other people that are suggesting that this is an entire hoax. They are insistent that the proximate causation of the actual initiation of the investigation that evolved into the Mueller investigation was actually initiated by this dossier. And the other side, the Democratic Party, DNC, Clinton administration, et cetera, their position has been quite clearly, it wasn't initiated. The investigation wasn't initiated by the existence of this dossier. That there was an independent investigation that was initiated by Jack Brennan, actually, the head of the CIA. Now, for whatever, the reason that the Trump people want to be able to sell people on the notion that it was this dossier that initiated the FBI investigation, the counterintelligence investigation, is because they are attributing the dossier to a biased undertaking on behalf of the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. They're asserting that it was they that hired Steele to do this dossier, thereby implying that he had a bias in reviewing the information and sources that he had. Now, there's a technical, multiple-stepped defense against that accusation. One of the problems is that in the present-day American political world, any argument that takes more than a bumper sticker to put it forth is missed by people. They kind of get lost in a compound sentence. Say nothing of a compound, complex sentence. And in this particular case, what it is that happened is that this group that was hired to do the investigation that hired Steele, this group is called the Fusion Group. This Fusion Group had been hired initially. It's called Fusion GPS. And Fusion GPS is a company that was hired originally in 2015, prior to the actual formal beginning of the campaign process for the election in 2016. It was hired by this conservative group, the Washington Free Beacon. And this conservative group was part of the Never Trump element within the Republican Party and Republican Party people, just lay people, not necessarily the leadership, but that this conservative group, the Washington Free Beacon, it was a publication that was trying to gather negative information about all of the different Republican candidates, but primarily Trump, on behalf of the never Trump elements in the Republican Party. And they were in operation from October of 2015 all the way into June and July of 2016, at which point it became clear that it was likely that Trump was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. At which point this Never Trump group withdrew their funding from the Fusion GPS and said, look, hey, we don't want any more investigation going on about this. Okay, now it's important to remember that at none of that time, between October 2015 and July of 2016, when the Fusion GPS group was doing its investigation and developing opposition research on Trump primarily, at no time did Fusion GPS employ Christopher Steele. He was not involved in any of that. So the fact that GPS was actually originally investigating Trump for a Republican group that was a Never Trump group isn't really salient to the issue of the bias or non-bias of Christopher Steele. But what happened is that after they would, well, actually before they withdrew, at the same time as Trump was becoming the more and more obvious nominee for the Republican Party, what happened is the law firm, the law firm that represented the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign, this what we call them the Cooey law firm. Let me see what their full name is here, but it's it's the Perkins Cooey. Perkins Cooey is a big, silk stocking, white shoe corporate law firm in Washington D.C. And Perkins Cooey did the legal work for both the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. And they, once it started becoming obvious to them that it was going to be Trump that was going to be the nominee, Perkins Cooey, on its own, as lawyers for the DNC and for the Clinton campaign, they decided to initiate investigations of Trump. And what happened is the Fusion GPS actually went to the Perkins Cooey law firm and said, look, we've been doing a bunch of opposition research on Trump for all of this time. Would you like to hire us to continue doing it for your clients, the DNC and the Clinton campaign? And the Perkins Cooey law firm said yes, and ended up paying the Fusion GPS over $1 million to do this investigation of him. And it was the Fusion GPS company that reached out and hired another private company to do the investigation, and they hired this Orbis Business Intelligence. They hired them to do the research, and it was Orbis that hired this fellow Christopher Steele. Okay, and so you've got 3 or 4 different steps being taken here, and it turns out that Steele didn't even know who it was that was paying for this investigation. That all he had been told was that it was a Washington law firm. And the actual charge that he had, the actual sort of marching orders, if you will, that he had were, he says, why is Donald Trump repeatedly seeking to do deals in such a notoriously corrupt police state as Russia that has his most serious, that all serious investors shun? That was the general question that was assigned to Christopher Steele by Orbis, who had been hired by Fusion GPS, who in turn had been hired by Perkins Coie. And so that when push comes to pull, there's going to be a clear defense on the part of Christopher Steele about the charge that he was biased because he was doing opposition research against Trump for the Clinton campaign. Okay? But the problem is that when any lawyer will tell you, when it takes you 2 or 3 minutes to explain to somebody your defense, you're losing. And you're going to lose half of your jury. They're not going to be able to follow those steps. But the bottom line is there appears to be a genuine, good faith explanation that Steele did not know that he was working for the Democratic Party. But what he did is when he began this investigation to try to find out why it is that Trump was doing so much business or trying to do so much business with Russia, that he came across this information. And the primary information that he ran into caused him to believe that Russia was in a position to blackmail Trump because of a number of videos that they had of him. Not just the one that a lot of people snicker about the most in Moscow, of him having these prostitutes do this stuff in this one hotel room, but other videos they had of him over in St. Petersburg earlier, and he was concerned that the explanation for why Trump was doing so much business with the oligarchs and accepting money from the oligarchs that was being laundered through this bank in Crete, the Deutsche Bank, was because they had the goods on him. Now, that is not that convincing. And the reality is a person that's as sophisticated as Christopher Steele and has spent 20 years working in the intelligence field, to just think that, an entire Russian state is going to be able to blackmail a president because of his certain sexual activities, is not the most convincing thing in the field of intelligence. And so there was a second set of things that, remember, he was asked to find out why it was that Trump was engaging to such a large extent in doing business with Russia. And so that he then turned to look at what the business was that he was actually doing with Russia. Okay? And that's where he began to see that a substantial portion of the monies that were flowing to Trump to build various Trump towers and condominium towers, etc., were in fact coming originally from the Russian oligarchs, and that they deposit their money in the Deutsche Bank in the island of Crete, and then he would be given the loans by the Deutsche Bank when virtually no other banks were willing to give him loans because of his terrible history of refusing to pay his debts.
Could you explain why he wouldn't just get the money directly from the oligarchs? Like, why do they have to go through a bank to make it more traceable?
Well, no, that's a good question. because the oligarchs were using depositing their money in the bank to launder the money. They would put the money, if they just embezzled the money and gave it to Trump, then he's basically getting embezzled money. What they're doing is they're taking their embezzled money, depositing it in the Deutsche Bank, and then Deutsche Bank is loaning money levered by the deposits, theoretically other money, that is getting clean money to Trump. And then Trump, what he does is he builds the towers and then rents them out and gets millions and millions of dollars, pays back the loan to the Deutsche Bank, and then the Deutsche Bank has clean funds. They have clean funds in there, and he's gotten clean funds, and the oligarchs have had their money laundered. So that's the reason for this stepped process that Christopher Steele ran into. And so what that did is it provided a alternative, potentially a supplemental reason, but perhaps an alternative to the less convincing argument that he was simply being blackmailed by Russia over these sex tapes. And so that was the original fallback position in the Steele dossier, is that it's possible that Trump had, instead of being blackmailed by the Russians, was in a sense beholden to them because of them being the primary source of the funding that he was getting, because he was being denied funding by Western banks. But then there is a third item in here, and he just touched upon it vaguely. He touched upon this question of the sale of the Russian oil and gas company, because he'd run into this fellow, Carter Page, and that Carter Page had suddenly appeared as a member of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Committee for Trump. And so that if, in fact, Trump had not put him on his Foreign Intelligence Advisory Committee, there might not have been any suspicion there to begin with. Now, what this does is it throws into some question the primary defense that's being made by the DNC and the Clinton administration that, oh, it wasn't the dossier that initiated the counterintelligence investigation by the FBI, it was Jack Brennan. And Jack Brennan in the CIA had somehow come into possession of information that led them to begin a counterintelligence investigation focusing on Carter Page. Okay, so the fact that there is this coincident identification by Steele in his dossier of Carter Page being on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Committee for Trump, and him having meetings with this Igor guy, who was the CEO of the Russian oil and gas company, and that there was this mysterious sale that was going on of 19.5% of the Russian oil company, and that here is Carter Page meeting with Igor and coming right back into the United States and meeting with the Trump people. Yes.
Do you know if this was before or after Exxon and Rosneft had started doing testing in the Arctic for oil and gas?
No, this was after. This was after. Yeah, this intended sale of the 20%, 19.5% of this was after they had entered into this drilling contract with Exxon, and so that there was this huge potential in the offing coming in here, and so that they were in a position to lever the sale of 20% of it. Now, so this is where it starts. The suspicions that you've heard me talk about here of the potential involvement of Trump himself and Putin as potential partners in this venture have to do with this sale of this 19.5% of the interest in the company. And it was never really followed up on in the Steele dossier. He sort of just brushed against it as sort of a third area over and above the sex tape blackmail thing, the loans with regard to the undue, I guess, dependence of Trump on that source of funding and becoming beholden, not blackmailed, but beholden to these oligarchs. This third option of there being this peculiar thing going on is all that really the dossier hinted at, that there was some other weird thing going on and they couldn't quite figure it out. And it's interesting because the coincidence of Jack Brennan beginning his investigation, his counterintelligence investigation, coming from the CIA, is not entirely convincing that it was completely independent of the Steele dossier. Because the argument that, oh, see, these are two completely independent things is predicated upon the fact that the CIA investigation that engaged the NSA and engaged the FBI counterintelligence division, it is predicated upon the fact that the dossier wasn't made public until 2 months after the CIA investigation was begun. But that doesn't mean that the CIA didn't know about it. You know, in fact, there were all kinds of people that knew about it running around inside Washington. In fact, there had been a gathering of national security reporters that gathered together to talk about this dossier that everybody rumored was floating around somewhere. And so that the question about whether or not Jack Brennan initiated this national security state investigation because he heard about the dossier is something they're going to have to deal with down the road, okay? Because what you see happening now is some of the right-wing senators in the Republican Party in the U.S. Senate are seizing upon this and insisting upon playing out this kind of simple theory that the entire investigation was initiated by the Steele dossier. And some of the sources of Christopher Steele were Russian intelligence people. And so they've actually gone so far as to say out loud that the real conspiracy with Russian intelligence was being undertaken by the DNC and the Clinton campaign. And so that there, as I said, you know, I'm rubber and you're glue thing. You know, that, oh no, it was you guys that were conspiring with the Russians to get intelligence information. And so that the reason I raise this thing about the Steele dossier is because it's, well, I discovered that there's a couple guys that I know pretty well that were involved in getting copies of the Steele dossier. One of them was a guy named Jonathan Weiner. I'll tell you a story about Jonathan Weiner. And the other one was David Korn. And David Korn is a person who ended up, after I knew him, becoming a rather constant reporter for Mother Jones. And then he became the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones magazine. And Jonathan Weiner was the legal counsel for John Kerry in John Kerry's Senate staff. But both of these guys ended up being given copies of the dossier, the original 16 memos, directly by Christopher Steele. And so the bottom line, the question is if Jonathan Weiner had these memos and David Korn had these memos, how could one possibly assume that the CIA didn't have them? And that wouldn't have been what really initiated the investigation. Okay? Yes.
Is Christopher Steele just working out of like his own office or something? I mean, like, where is he?
He has his own business in London. He has a private intelligence, business intelligence office. And,
Based in the United States.
no, he's in London. He's in London. Okay, and what he did is when Steele started getting this information from his various sources, Russian sources, intelligence sources from different places, he got so concerned about the blackmail aspect of this that he brought, he called a guy in the FBI who was assigned to the Rome embassy in Europe, and went to see him and told him about this potential blackmail information. And that person working under the cover of the State Department, who was a real FBI guy, was the head of the European and Eurasian organized crime strike force for the FBI. And so the approach that was made by Steele to this particular guy was under the guise of it being like an organized crime blackmail conspiracy against Trump. So he brought it to him, not to the counterintelligence division, for whatever value that has, and it has some. So that the actual investigation that was initiated by Jack Brennan was initiated in the counterintelligence division of FBI. And so the people inside Washington, I discover after spending 20 years there, are a lot more impressed by the distinctions between one department and another department of the FBI than lay people are. They're saying, what are you kidding? It's your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing. Well, that's true, as it turns out, a lot of times in Washington, D.C. But I don't find it that credible, actually. But the bottom line is, whether it was the reference in the Steele dossier to these three different elements that generated the investigation, the counterintelligence investigation, the fact that the counterintelligence investigation's first action, the Jack Brennan investigation inside the counterintelligence division of the FBI, the fact that their first overt act in their investigation was to get a FISA warrant, against Carter Page, is very important here, because the reference in the Steele dossier to Carter Page all had to do with this mysterious oil deal that was going on and the potential involvement of Trump and his people in that. And yet, you don't see that surface anywhere. You don't see it rise to the top of the list in the Steele dossier. You don't see it rise to the top of the list with the FBI Eurasian Organized Crime Strike Force investigation, and you don't see it rise to the top even in the counterintelligence investigation. What they do is they start going for Trump's business activities. Okay, they go to the second one, the second item in the Steele dossier. They start going after his business activities with the oligarchs, because the Central Intelligence Agency views the oligarchs as basically synonymous with Putin, because they view Putin to be a criminal. And that's a very unsophisticated analysis, if I say so myself, of the Central Intelligence Agency. Putin is a lot more than a common criminal, and it might make it easier for them to try to sell that image to the American people. But they ought to be more sophisticated themselves to not fall for that, drinking their own Kool-Aid. The bottom line is that Putin is a part of it's not that he's not embezzling billions of dollars. Don't get me wrong. You don't get to have $93 billion because you're just the head of Russia, But the bottom line is that Putin is using, I've mentioned to you before, some not insignificant portion of the money that he's embezzling in rebuilding all of the Russian Orthodox churches in Russia, and building up that entire infrastructure of Mother Russia again, having accepted the spinning off of all of the, quote, ethnic provinces of the Soviet Union. And so he's into a much more sophisticated game. He's involved in a chess game, against the CIA that may well be still playing checkers against him, and just making simple moves and seeing whether he's a criminal and whether he's embezzling money and all of that. Whereas he's involved in this much more sophisticated program, and his relationship with the oligarchs in Russia is just a simple necessity. If he's going to remain in power in Russia and become the new divinely ordained czar of Russia by the Russian Orthodox Church, he's got to have the cooperation of the oligarchs. And so this big play that's going on right now is, and I want us to continue to follow what's going on here, because remember, the fundamental potential rationale behind what Trump is doing, if it's not simple corruption on his part and simple corruption on Putin's part, to potentially be partners in this intertrust group that is one of the secret beneficiaries of this 19.5% interest in the Russian oil company. If they're engaged in a more sophisticated operation, it could well be the effort to monopolize all of the oil in the world and isolate China from getting access to it. And that harkens all the way back to that second iteration of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Plan and Guidance document that I told you about, that was generated at the very end of the Cold War, back in January of 1992. Well, actually, it was generated after April, the second iteration. But what I'm saying is that there is a major game of Go being played here by China. Russia is playing chess. The Central Intelligence Agency and Jack Brennan and the people may be playing checkers. And it may well be that Trump is basically playing marbles. It doesn't even know what he's doing. And just kind of looking to see how he can get as much money as he can, and figuring, even if he only has one term, he's ingratiating himself to Russia, and he's going to get the Trump Tower built, and he's going to get, and he's going to have a partnership interest in potentially a $10 trillion operation with the oil. So you see that there are different levels of consciousness going on involved in what's happening here. And what you see this morning, I'm just going to alert you for something that might happen tomorrow. Okay. That Trump this morning, while Nadler is going around on MSNBC and all these other places declaring this state of constitutional crisis that we're all in right now, Trump is holding a press conference announcing his plans to potentially impose an additional 25% tariff on China, right? To try to force them to the table to make concessions to the U.S. It's just this hammer-handed treatment of China, basically ignoring the fact that we're in debt up to our chin to China, because of the imbalanced trade stuff that he keeps whining about. And I've been talking with some people who are indicating that China is getting ready tomorrow afternoon to withdraw from all of the trade negotiations with the United States because of Trump being such a complete heavy-handed moron. And that they're going to turn and focus on establishing a new alliance with Russia and having them be their major trading partners, potentially getting access to this Russian oil. And at the same time, if that doesn't work out, they're in the process of building this gigantic company that is going to be making 3 million electric cars every year to sell at rock bottom prices to everybody all around the world to completely undermine the petroleum businesses, okay? Because it'll be not only automobile, regular passenger cars and stuff, but trucks and all kinds of other vehicles that are all electric. And so the reason I raise this to you is because I want you to understand that in doing the simple assignments that I've asked you to do, the reading of the summaries of the 2 volumes, the looking at that Spygate thing, and be following the things that we're talking about here, is because I want you to be able to have the basic information and knowledge that you need to have to follow the more sophisticated arguments about what's going on here. Okay, as I say, you have to be able to walk before you can run, and you need to be able to know how to play chopsticks on the piano before you can play Mozart. And there's a very sophisticated phenomenon going on here. And it's not clear what is understood about this on the part of, for example, someone as wonderful as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the people that are saying, let's impeach this guy, let's just run him out of office here, let's get rid of this guy, and they come pouring it on. And for example, the argument is being made, not unconvincingly, as you've made it yourself here, is that, to impeach this guy, right, it's going to take as long to get him impeached as it would to get him unelected. And so, but if you impeach him, it's going to make all of his opponents, his support people, go crazy. It's going to have him playing the victim here. And yet other people are doing it simply as a matter of principle. I shouldn't say simply as a matter of principle, but as a matter of principle, including all the way up to Lawrence Tribe. The principal American constitutional scholar in the world, and other constitutional historians are all saying that if the House Judiciary Committee, under the control of the Democratic Party, doesn't exercise its constitutional duty to impeach this guy for all the things that he's doing here, they're going to establish such a horrific precedent for other presidents to be able to get away with what they might want to do. And on the other hand, the Nancy Pelosi's and the Chuck Schumers are making the argument on the other side, is that, look, this is really risky. By impeaching him as a matter of principle, you actually make it harder potentially for us to defeat him in the election. Because he's going to stir up all of his base. He's going to be playing the victim all the time. And the bottom line is that's going to give him a better chance to win than if we just sort of roll out one investigation after another here, tarring him up and raising fundamental questions about his ethics and his respect for law, and giving him more and more opportunities to lie to people. And after all, the Democratic Party did win 3 million more votes than he did last time. But it was just a matter of like 70,000 votes in these 3 states. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that I don't want it to be too much information, but what I'm saying is that we need to evaluate whether or not, this is the bottom line, whether or not it's possible to have one of the principal articles of impeachment be Trump's position on global climate change. Because to be at a time in history when a person comes into office and starts decimating all of the environmental protection standards and in ordering, violating the Administrative Procedures Act and all constitutional principles, ordering these pipelines to go on through public parklands and Native American lands, and opening up the seacoast for drilling and all that kind of stuff, right in the face of a clear resolution on the part of 193 nations at the Paris Peace Accords in December 2015, that they acknowledge that global climate change is a huge threat to the human family, and that we've got to seriously reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we burn. And here's this guy, you know, increasing the amounts of global greenhouse gas emissions willfully and defiantly, and in fact, they're not even discussing impeaching him for that. They've got to go over into all this other stuff because they're all trapped in these internal ideas about, oh, he defied the FBI, he wouldn't talk to the FBI, he wouldn't turn over the documents, he wouldn't testify. You know, there are all these kind of technical things. It's again, it's like trying to, you know, indict Al Capone for income tax evasion. You know, here he is gunning people down in the streets and you can't get at him. Why is that? You know, and so that what I would like us to be able to do is to turn our attention to trying to figure out in this course what the connections are between a potential impeachable offense and global climate change. The reason being that we can then mobilize the same amount of people in the country that are concerned or afraid about global climate change to understand they need to get him out of office for that reason. Okay, just like they said that, you know, one of the major reasons why it was possible to successfully impeach and convict Richard Nixon was because of the huge lack of support for him because of the Vietnam War. That whole long process of organizing people against the Vietnam War came to full fruition basically by getting him impeached and removed. Okay, so getting Jimmy Carter basically brought in. Okay, so that's the reason that I'm raising these things for you. And so that having been said about the Steele dossier, what I would like to do is I would like to address the second issue, and that is that even though this crisis doesn't in fact manifest itself in a Chinese symbol that says it's both danger and opportunity, but let's take a look at the dangers that I've raised some of them. The danger of impeaching him, the first and most obvious one we've talked about, is the fact that it may stir up his base, mobilize his base, and given the fact that it's likely that he would be acquitted in the Senate, it would give him an opportunity to say, see, I've been completely exonerated by the Senate. I've been found not guilty. And therefore, the Democrats are abusing the entire system of law by, first of all, having the whole Mueller investigation that basically, in his words, deprived me of my whole first 2 years in office. You know, therefore entitling me to an additional term. Okay? Okay, that's his position. But they've gone so far as to invoke the impeachment process of tying up the United States Congress to keep us from doing the things we need to do to help the American people. You know, like build the infrastructure and stuff, which he isn't in favor of doing anyhow. You know, so that this is the more obvious danger, But what I'd like to ask you to do is think about what are some of the other dangers involved in impeaching him, if in fact the likelihood is that he's going to be acquitted by the Senate.
I mean, his supporters could probably frame it as a way, if you don't like the president's foreign policy, you're just going to go ahead and try and impeach him. Because Trump may try to play it off that his dealings with Russia is all just part of maybe an aggressive economic foreign policy.
Yeah.
The Democrats aren't very fond.
And therefore, they would attempt to impeach the next Democratic president.
If they don't like
With the same precedent. Therefore, the common law practice had been established that in light of the fact that you don't have the evidence to get him convicted and you're going to use the impeachment process against him anyhow, it's just because you don't like his foreign policy, that's going to establish a standard where they're going to do it. And therefore, it would end up destabilizing the American executive branch. Right? That's another problem. So what other fundamental dangers do you think that there are?
I think really depends on the reasoning that they impeach him for. And if they base it off of this notion that he's essentially lied to the FBI and this kind of stuff along those guidelines, then we're going to see, well, as all impeachments are, it's a shift in power. And we're going to see that shift in power go to the security state and further entrench us in a system of surveillance and a system of control from the mission.
That's the big one. That's the other big one. And you were correct in yours. That's the other big one. That in fact, if they succeed in getting him impeached, even if he's not convicted, that what's going to happen is that people are going to start relying more and more as the good guys, Jack Brennan, the FBI, Comey, the assistant FBI, and the others, that the people are unknowingly or unwittingly backing up into a national security state. Because the type of tactics that are being used by the opponents of Trump, because they're so offended by him, and there is such a groundswell of opposition to him on the part of basically everybody who reads more than 2 books a year in the country, that they're all feeling they're playing kind of loosey-goosey here with the rules, and that they're even going to the point of breaking down the doors of his lawyer's office and dragging him in and making the lawyer testify about the most confidential conversations that they had as the lawyer. So they're undermining the attorney-client privilege, and very clearly they are seriously undermining the executive privilege of the president. I mean, they've got people right now jumping up and down, marching in the streets because Trump doesn't want to reveal to the CIA and the State Department what his conversations are with another head of state. I mean, it's absolutely clear that the president has the right, he's got the explicit right under the Constitution to establish treaties. And so he has a complete right. I mean, that's like saying that, Roosevelt, when he was talking to Churchill, that he had to have the State Department people sitting around taking notes so that everybody would know what he was saying. That is just not true. That was never understood as being a limitation on the power of the president. That somehow these national security state agencies all had to be informed about what he was doing, and that he had to take his direction from them, that he wasn't entitled to actually come up with his own ideas. He had to do what the bureaucracy basically wanted him to do.